In the early days of the Pacific War, a new Japanese aircraft haunted the skies. Allied pilots would see this twin-engine bomber and know they were in for a tough fight. They called it the Betty. To the Japanese, it was the Mitsubishi G4M, a symbol of their naval air power. Its legend was forged in fire, but ironically, its greatest weakness was fire itself. This is the story of the Betty bomber, the infamous flying lighter. When the G4M first appeared, it was a marvel of aeronautical engineering. Just look at it. It had this long, sleek, almost cigar-shaped fuselage. It was a beautiful aircraft, incredibly streamlined for a bomber of its size. This design wasn't just for looks, it was all about performance. The G4M was fast, surprisingly agile for a medium bomber, and it could fly further than almost anything else in the sky. It was designed to project Japan's power far across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. And that was its killer feature, range. The Japanese naval staff had an almost impossible requirement. They wanted a land-based bomber that could take off from bases in places like Formosa, now Taiwan, fly all the way to targets in the Philippines or Malaysia, drop its bombs or torpedoes, and fly all the way back. This was a round trip of thousands of miles, a distance that most contemporary bombers simply couldn't dream of covering. To achieve this, Mitsubishi's designers, led by Kiro Honjo, had to make some very specific, and ultimately, very dangerous choices. In the first few months of the war, the Betty bomber seemed unstoppable. Its most stunning success came just 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 10, 1941, a force of G4M bombers, alongside the older G3M Nell, found the pride of the British Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet off the coast of Malaya. This was Force Z, consisting of the modern battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. Without any friendly fighter cover, the two capital ships were sitting ducks. The Bettys and Nells swept in, launching wave after wave of torpedo attacks. In less than 2 hours, both ships were at the bottom of the South China Sea. It was a shocking demonstration of air power. For the first time in history, capital ships, fully operational and maneuvering at sea, had been sunk purely by aircraft. The Betty had proven its worth and became the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This victory, and others like it, cemented the G4M's reputation. It was the premier long-range attack bomber of the IJN. It could strike anywhere, anytime. Allied forces were stunned. How could a bomber fly so far? What was the secret to its incredible performance? When American forces first encountered the Betty over places like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, they were desperate to get their hands on a downed one. They needed to dissect it, to understand what made it tick. They knew there had to be a secret, a design trade-off that gave it that amazing range. And they were right. When they finally got to examine a crashed G4M, the secret was laid bare, and it was horrifying. To achieve that incredible range, the designers had packed the aircraft with fuel, and I mean packed. The wings were designed as integral fuel tanks, meaning the entire internal structure of the wing, from tip to tip, was filled with aviation gasoline. There were no separate, self-sealing rubber bladders like those found in most American aircraft. The skin of the wing itself was the wall of the fuel tank. This was a massive gamble. Self-sealing fuel tanks were a known technology. They had a layer of rubber that would swell up and seal a puncture when hit by a bullet, preventing a catastrophic fuel leak and fire. But they were heavy, and heavy meant less range. So the G4M's designers omitted them. Not only that, they also left out any significant armor plating for the crew or other critical components. The goal was to make the aircraft as light as possible, to squeeze every last mile out of every drop of fuel. The result was an aircraft that was, in essence, a flying fuel tank. American fighter pilots quickly discovered this fatal flaw. All it took was a few well-placed rounds from their .50 caliber machine guns into the wings of a Betty, and the result was almost always the same, a brilliant, instantaneous explosion. The bomber would erupt in a ball of flame, often disintegrating in mid-air. One moment it was a sleek, silver bomber. The next, a plume of black smoke and falling debris. It was a terrifying sight. Pilots started calling it the one-shot lighter, or the flying Zippo, because one spark was all it took. The name that stuck was the flying lighter. For the Japanese crews who flew the Betty, it was a death trap. They were brave, highly trained, and dedicated airmen, but they were flying an aircraft that offered them almost no protection. They knew the risks. They called their own plane the Hamaki, the Japanese word for cigar, partly due to its shape and partly due to its tendency to light up when hit. Imagine flying into combat, thousands of miles from home, knowing that the slightest damage could turn your aircraft into an inferno. The psychological toll must have been immense. Despite their early successes, as the war dragged on, and Allied fighter technology and tactics improved, the loss rates for G4M crews became astronomical. They were sent out on mission after mission, often without adequate fighter escort, to face swarms of American Hellcats and Corsairs. It was a slaughter. One of the most famous and tragic missions involving the G4M Betty had nothing to do with combat. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a message detailing an inspection tour by the commander of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most important naval leader. The Americans knew his exact route, his timing, and the type of aircraft he would be flying in: 2 G4M Betty bombers, escorted by Zero fighters. An ambush was planned. A squadron of P-38 Lightning fighters was dispatched on a long-range interception mission. They found Yamamoto's transport exactly where the intelligence said it would be. In the brief, violent air battle that followed, the P-38s shot down both Bettys. The one carrying Admiral Yamamoto crashed into the jungle of Bougainville Island, killing everyone on board. The loss of their greatest strategist was a devastating blow to Japan. A blow delivered because the aircraft he was flying in was so notoriously vulnerable. As the war neared its end, the Betty was adapted for a final desperate role. It became one of the primary mother ships for the Oka, a rocket-powered, piloted flying bomb. The Betty would carry the Oka underneath its fuselage, fly as close as it could to the American fleet, and then release it. The Oka pilot would then guide his craft, essentially a 2,600-pound warhead with wings, into an enemy ship. These missions were incredibly dangerous. The Betty, already a vulnerable target, was now even slower and less maneuverable, carrying its deadly payload. Many Bettys were shot down long before they could even get in range to launch the Oka, taking the crews of both aircraft with them. It was a grim final chapter for an aircraft that began its career as the pride of the fleet. So how should we remember the Mitsubishi G4M Betty? It's a complex legacy. On one hand, it was a brilliant piece of design for its time, achieving a range and performance that was unmatched at the start of the war. It was responsible for some of Japan's greatest early victories. But on the other hand, it was a fundamentally flawed and dangerous aircraft. The design choices that gave it its amazing range also made it a fiery coffin for thousands of its crew members. The story of the Betty is a stark reminder of the brutal trade-offs of wartime engineering, where performance is often bought at a terrible human cost. It was sleek, it was powerful, and it was a legend of the Pacific skies. But for the men who flew it, it was, and always will be, the flying lighter. The inspection, disbelief in the hangar. The team's primary mission is to understand its survivability. Allied bombers were built like flying fortresses, heavy with armor, and most importantly, self-sealing fuel tanks. These marvels of engineering used layers of rubber that would swell and seal a puncture hole almost instantly, preventing catastrophic fuel leaks and fires. So the first order of business is to find these tanks on the Betty. A mechanic grabs his tools and pries open a wing inspection panel. He looks inside, then looks again, confusion etched on his face. He calls over his superior. Soon, a small crowd gathers, each person peering into the wing, their expressions shifting from curiosity to sheer astonishment. there's nothing there. No complex layers of rubber, no self-sealing mechanism, not even a basic protective lining. What they saw was just bare aluminum. Inside the massive wing, which doubled as a giant fuel tank, highly flammable, high-octane aviation fuel sloshed around against nothing but a thin metal skin. A single bullet, a piece of shrapnel, even a spark from a ricochet could turn the entire wing into a raging inferno. It wasn't a fuel tank, it was a bomb waiting to be armed. One of the lead engineers, after running his hand along the unprotected interior, finally broke the stunned silence. He looked at his colleagues and asked the question on everyone's mind: are they insane? How could any nation send its crews into combat in a plane so vulnerable? It defied all logic, all principles of aircraft design they held dear. To them, it was a flying death trap. This discovery highlighted the stark, fundamental difference in design philosophy between the United States and Japan at the time. The American approach was centered on survivability. Planes like the B-17 Flying Fortress were packed with armor plating to protect the crew and critical systems. They had multiple redundant controls and those life-saving, self-sealing fuel tanks. The idea was simple: get the crew to the target and, just as importantly, get them home. This made the planes heavy, sometimes slower, but incredibly tough. Japanese designers, on the other hand, were obsessed with performance above all else, especially range and speed. To achieve the incredible long-range capabilities the Betty was famous for, every possible ounce of weight had to be saved. Armor was the first thing to go. Protective systems were deemed an unnecessary luxury. By stripping the plane down to its bare essentials, they could pack it with more fuel and fly farther and faster than its allied counterparts. This philosophy was rooted in a different tactical doctrine. Early in the war, Japan's elite and highly experienced pilots could often outmaneuver their opponents, avoiding getting hit in the first place. The offensive capability of the aircraft at speed, range, and torpedo-carrying capacity was prioritized over the defensive protection of the crew. The aircraft was an expendable weapon, and sadly, the crew was often seen in the same light. This lightweight design gave the Betty its impressive initial performance, but it came at a terrifying cost. As the war progressed and Allied pilots and aircraft became more advanced, the Betty's fatal flaw was brutally exposed. American fighters armed with powerful .50 caliber machine guns learned that a short burst into the Betty's wings would almost guarantee a spectacular explosion. Japanese crews weren't ignorant of the danger. They grimly nicknamed their own bomber the Type 1 lighter or the Flying Cigar because of its tendency to ignite so easily. They knew that each mission was a gamble against impossible odds. Imagine the courage it took to climb into that cockpit, knowing that your aircraft's own fuel could become your funeral pyre at any moment. The story of the Betty bomber is a sobering lesson in the trade-offs of wartime engineering. It is a tale of two clashing philosophies, one that valued the machine and the mission over the man, and another that believed the crew's survival was paramount to winning the long war. The engineers in that hangar didn't just uncover a design flaw. They uncovered a worldview that was completely alien to their own. The Flying Lighter was more than just a flawed aircraft. It was a symbol of a desperate strategy, a testament to the bravery of its crews, and a chilling reminder of the brutal calculus of war. The deadly trade-off, range over human life. Picture this. It's the late 1930s. The vast Pacific Ocean is becoming the next great theater of war. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, controlling these immense distances was everything. They needed a bomber that could fly further than any other, a plane that could strike deep into enemy territory from bases far away and return. This obsession with range became the single most important design requirement for their new land-based naval bomber. The engineers at Mitsubishi were given a monumental task: build a plane with unprecedented endurance. And they succeeded, but at a terrible, terrible cost. To achieve this incredible range, the G4M's designers made a series of fateful decisions. The first and most famous was the wet wing concept. Now this sounds advanced, but in the case of the Betty, it was a recipe for disaster. Essentially, the entire wing structure, which was large and long to provide lift for long-distance flight, was also the fuel tank. There were no separate, sealed fuel bladders inside. The fuel was literally sloshing around inside the wing's metal skin. This design saved a huge amount of weight, which in turn allowed the plane to carry more fuel and fly further. The wings held a massive amount of aviation gasoline, turning the aircraft into a flying fuel tanker. So you have this beautiful, sleek aircraft, capable of flying over 2,400 miles. But what happens when it gets into combat? An enemy fighter just needed to land a few well-placed machine gun rounds into those enormous wings. A single incendiary bullet could be enough. Once the fuel was ignited, the wing would erupt in a massive fireball. The structural integrity would vanish in an instant, and the plane would disintegrate in mid-air. This is how the Betty earned its infamous nickname, the one-shot lighter or the flying Zippo. Allied pilots quickly learned that a short burst into the Betty's wings was a guaranteed kill. You might be thinking, couldn't they have protected the fuel tanks? Absolutely. Other nations were already using self-sealing fuel tanks. This technology was relatively simple. The tanks were lined with layers of rubber and other materials. When a bullet pierced the tank, the fuel would leak out and cause the rubber lining to swell, sealing the hole and preventing a catastrophic fire. It added weight, of course, and that was the problem. For the Japanese designers obsessed with range, that extra weight was unacceptable. It would have reduced the Betty's flight distance, compromising its primary mission objective. So they just left them out. No self-sealing tanks, no protection. The problem wasn't just the fuel. To keep the aircraft as light as possible, another critical element was sacrificed: armor. There was virtually no armor plating to protect the crew. The pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and gunner sat inside a thin aluminum shell. They were completely exposed to enemy fire. While American bombers like the B-17 were famous for being flying fortresses, bristling with armor that could soak up incredible amounts of damage, the Betty was a fragile masterpiece. A burst of machine gun fire that might just scratch the paint on a B-17 could rip through the Betty's fuselage and tear through the crew inside. This combination of unprotected fuel tanks and no armor made flying a Betty bomber an incredibly dangerous mission. The crews knew it. They called their own plane hamaki, the Japanese word for cigar, because of its long cylindrical shape and its tendency to light up when hit. They were flying in a tinderbox, and they were acutely aware of it. The bravery of these men, flying into combat knowing their aircraft had such a fatal flaw, is truly astounding. They were skilled and dedicated, but they were let down by the very machine they were asked to fly. The obsession with distance was rooted in Japan's strategic situation. As an island nation with limited resources, Japan planned for a swift and decisive war. They needed to project power across the vast Pacific, hitting targets in the Philippines, Malaya, and beyond. The Betty was the tool for that job. In the early days of the war, it was incredibly effective. Its long range caught the Allies completely by surprise. Betty bombers were responsible for sinking the British battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, a shocking demonstration of the power of naval aviation. In these early victories, when the Betty faced limited opposition, its weaknesses weren't as apparent. But as the war dragged on and the Allies introduced better fighters, like the F-4U Corsair and the F-6F Hellcat, the Betty's flaws became tragically obvious. The skies became a much deadlier place. The kill ratios were staggering. Squadrons of Bettys would be sent on missions, and only a handful would return. The Marianas Turkey Shoot is a famous example of how American naval aviation decimated Japanese air power, and the Betty bombers were among the easiest targets. Despite later attempts to add self-sealing tanks and some armor to newer models, the fundamental design was just too compromised. These additions added weight, which made the already sluggish plane even less maneuverable. And it was too little too late. The Betty story is a powerful lesson in military design and the compromises of war. It shows what happens when a single performance characteristic, in this case range, is pursued to the exclusion of all else, especially crew survivability. The aircraft was a product of a specific strategic mindset, one that ultimately proved to be flawed. While the Betty was an engineering marvel in terms of its aerodynamics and range, it failed in its most basic duty, to protect the men who flew it. It serves as a stark reminder that in warfare, the balance between offense, defense, and endurance is critical. Sacrificing one for the other can lead to disastrous consequences. The Flying Lighter wasn't just a nickname. It was a eulogy for the thousands of airmen who perished inside its fragile frame. The one-shot lighter, combat realities. The G4M was a marvel of aeronautical engineering for its time. When it first appeared, its performance stunned the Allies. It could fly farther and faster than many contemporary bombers, allowing the Imperial Japanese Navy to strike targets deep behind enemy lines. This incredible range was its greatest asset, but it came at a terrible price. To achieve it, the designers at Mitsubishi made a fateful decision. They didn't include self-sealing fuel tanks or armor protection for the crew. The wings were essentially giant, unprotected tanks of high-octane gasoline. This meant that any stray bullet, any piece of shrapnel from an anti-aircraft shell, could turn the bomber into an inferno in seconds. American pilots quickly learned that a short burst aimed at the wings was all they needed. The Betty would erupt in flames, earning it that chilling moniker, the one-shot lighter. The Japanese crews were acutely aware of the danger. They weren't stupid. They knew the plane's vulnerabilities better than anyone. They called it hamaki, or cigar, because it was long, cylindrical, and lit up far too easily. Imagine the psychological pressure. Every mission was a roll of the dice. Every encounter with enemy fighters was a life-or-death gamble where the odds were heavily stacked against you. While Allied bomber crews in Europe faced their own horrors, they flew in planes like the B-17 Flying Fortress, which were legendary for their ability to absorb incredible amounts of damage and still bring their crews home. The Betty offered no such comfort. It was a fragile glass cannon. The courage it took to climb into that cockpit, knowing you were flying a tinderbox, is almost unimaginable. Perhaps the most famous Betty ever shot down was the one carrying the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. An audacious plan, Operation Vengeance, was hatched. A squadron of long-range P-38 Lightning fighters was dispatched on a mission to intercept and kill the admiral. They flew hundreds of miles over open ocean, navigating by compass and clock, to arrive at the precise time and place. As Yamamoto's transport, a G4M Betty, and its escort descended for a landing, the P-38s pounced. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber engaged the admiral's plane. With a burst of cannon and machine gun fire, they hit the Betty's wing. True to its reputation, it immediately caught fire and spiraled into the dense jungle below. The death of Yamamoto was a devastating blow to Japanese morale and a spectacular demonstration of the Betty's infamous vulnerability. The most important man in the Imperial Japanese Navy was brought down by the very design flaw his own forces had to contend with daily. You might be thinking, what about fighter escorts? Didn't the Betty fly with the legendary S-6M-0? Yes, it did. The Zero was one of the world's best dogfighters early in the war, and its pilots were incredibly skilled. They could often sweep the skies of Allied fighters, providing a protective screen for the bombers. But there was a problem. As the war progressed, the Allies introduced new, more powerful fighters like the P-38 Lightning, the F-4U Corsair, and the F-6F Hellcat. These planes could match or even outperform the Zero, especially at high altitudes. More importantly, they were heavily armed and incredibly durable. American pilots adopted tactics like the thatch weave that negated the Zero's maneuverability advantage. A group of Hellcats could tear through a Zero escort, and once they broke through, the Bettys were sitting ducks. The Zeros simply couldn't be everywhere at once, and it only took one or two determined American fighters to slip through the screen and wreak havoc on the bomber formation. The shield that the Zeros provided was becoming less and less reliable. Nowhere was the Betty's tragic story more evident than during the brutal campaigns in the Solomon Islands and over New Guinea. These theaters of war saw some of the most intense and bloody air combat of the entire Pacific conflict. Day after day, formations of Bettys would fly out from their bases like Rabaul to attack Allied shipping and airfields on islands like Guadalcanal. And day after day, they would be met by a swarm of American fighters. The skies over the Solomons became a graveyard for Japanese bomber crews. Formations would be decimated, with sometimes less than half the planes returning to base. These weren't just isolated incidents. It was a sustained, grinding massacre. The American pilots from the Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal became experts at exploiting the Betty's weaknesses. The constant losses of experienced crews and valuable aircraft were unsustainable. Japan was bleeding its naval air arm dry against an enemy that was only growing stronger. Each flaming wreck plunging into the Pacific was another nail in the coffin of the Japanese war effort. So what was it actually like for the men inside? We have to rely on scattered accounts and diaries, but they paint a grim picture. The fear was a constant companion. The noise inside the uninsulated fuselage was deafening. The smell of oil and high-octane fuel was ever present, a constant reminder of the inferno waiting to be unleashed. The gunners, cramped in their positions with limited fields of fire, could only watch as enemy fighters lined up for their attack runs. They'd see the flashes from the enemy's guns, and then a flash in their own wing. The intercom would fill with screams as fire ripped through the fuselage. The structure would fail, and the plane would begin its final terrifying plunge. There was no escape. Parachutes were often useless as the G-forces of the spin pinned the men to their seats, or the fire consumed them before they could even try to bail out. It was a horrifying, brutal way to die. For the few who survived these missions, the psychological toll was immense. They watched their friends and comrades burn, knowing that next time it could easily be them. This was the reality of flying the Hamaki, the flying torch. Later in the war, the Japanese tried to fix the Betty's problems. New variants like the G4M2 and G4M3 were introduced with some armor protection and rudimentary self-sealing fuel tanks, but it was too little, too late. The fundamental design was still flawed, and these improvements often came at the cost of performance, reducing the very range that made the Betty so valuable in the first place. By this stage of the war, Japan was on the defensive, and the Betty was often used in desperate measures. One of its most infamous final roles was as the mothership for the Oka rocket-powered kamikaze bomb. A Betty would carry the Oka to within range of an Allied fleet, release it, and then the suicide pilot would guide the bomb to its target. It was a gruesome end for an aircraft that began the war as a symbol of Japanese air power. The story of the Betty bomber is a powerful lesson in military design. It shows how a single-minded focus on one characteristic, in this case, extreme range, can lead to catastrophic vulnerabilities. It's a tale of technological trade-offs and the brutal realities of air combat. But most of all, it's a human story. It is about the incredible bravery and terrible sacrifice of the thousands of young men who were ordered to fly this beautiful, deadly machine. They knew they were flying a death trap, a one-shot lighter, yet they flew it anyway, into the fire and the flak, day after day. Their story is a sobering reminder of the true cost of war. Lessons of the ashes, the legacy of the G4M. From a distance, the Betty was impressive. It was a sleek twin-engine bomber designed with one primary goal in mind: range. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, The ability to strike targets far from home was a massive strategic advantage for the Imperial Japanese Navy. To achieve this incredible reach, the G4M's designers made some radical and ultimately fatal choices. The key to its long legs was fuel, and lots of it. The wings of the Betty were essentially massive, unarmored fuel tanks. They were designed as integral wet wings, meaning the fuel was held directly inside the wing structure itself, without separate, self-sealing bladder tanks. This design philosophy was a high-stakes gamble. By eliminating heavy armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, which were becoming standard in American aircraft, the Betty could fly further and faster. On paper, it was a world-class bomber. In the early days of the war, this paid off. Bettys played a crucial role in sinking the British warships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, a stunning demonstration of air power over naval might. For a moment, the gamble seemed to have worked, but the tide of war quickly turned, and the Betty's fatal flaw was brutally exposed. Allied fighter pilots, particularly those in rugged and heavily armed planes like the Grumman F-4F Wildcat and later the F-6F Hellcat, discovered its vulnerability. A single burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire into those enormous wings was often enough to turn the Betty into a blazing inferno. Pilots described seeing them ignite from wingtip to wingtip in a split second, earning it the grim monikers One Shot Lighter, the Flying Zippo, and the Flying Cigar, because it would light up from one end. The very feature that gave it its greatest strength, its massive fuel load, became its greatest weakness. So why was it designed this way? It comes down to a fundamental difference in military philosophy. For the Japanese High Command, the aircraft and its mission objective were paramount. The lives of the crew, while valued, were secondary to achieving the strategic goal. The emphasis was on offensive capability above all else. Range and speed were prioritized over crew survivability. This contrasted sharply with the American approach, which increasingly valued the pilot as a highly trained and difficult-to-replace asset. American planes like the B-17 Flying Fortress were famous for their ability to absorb incredible amounts of damage and still bring their crews home. They were slower and heavier, but they were built to last. The Betty was not. The human cost of this design choice was staggering. Thousands of experienced Japanese airmen were lost in these flammable bombers. Imagine the courage it took for those crews, knowing the reputation of their aircraft, to climb aboard for mission after mission. They flew with skill and bravery, often deep into enemy territory with little or no fighter escort, fully aware that a few well-placed shots could mean a fiery end. Their dedication is a somber testament to the pressures of their duty. As the war progressed, later versions of the G4M tried to address these issues. Some models were fitted with rudimentary fire extinguishing systems and a bit more armor, but it was too little, too late. The fundamental design of the integral wing tanks couldn't be easily changed, and the Betty's reputation was sealed. When the war ended, American technical teams swarmed over captured Japanese aircraft, including the G4M. Their analysis confirmed what their pilots already knew. The post-war evaluation reports highlighted the complete lack of armor and self-sealing tanks as a critical design failure. For American engineers and strategists, the Betty became a case study in what not to do. It reinforced the value of survivability and crew protection, principles that would heavily influence Western aircraft design for decades to come. The era of the unarmored wet wing was over. The global standard shifted decisively toward protected, self-sealing fuel systems in all combat aircraft. The legacy of the G4M Betty is a complicated one. It was an aircraft born of a specific strategic need, representing a peak of Japanese aeronautical engineering in terms of range and performance. Yet, it was also a tragic symbol of a design philosophy that placed the machine above the man. It serves as a powerful reminder that in the calculus of war, the most advanced technology is meaningless if it can't bring its operators home. The story of the Flying Lighter is not just about metal and fuel. It is about the brave men who flew them and the ultimate price paid for a design that prioritized range over survival. What do you think? Was the Betty's long-range capability worth the immense risk to its crews? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this look into aviation history, be sure to like and subscribe for more. See you next time.